Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda DeMeo, and on behalf of the Darien Library, we welcome you for tonight's program, Celebrating Sondheim with Gil Harel. I'm really excited about this one, and I hope you are too. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this available, as well as our collections to the community. Now, our presenter this evening, I'm sure you've been to one of our lovely Gil Harel programs before. He is a professor of musicology and music theory at Naugatuck Valley Community College. He wears many hats, including conducting the college chorale, the a cappella ensemble, and he is the musical director of theater productions, which we just spoke about. Can you share your spring production that's in the works?
Absolutely. We will be putting on a limited run of the Putnam County Spelling Bee, which is a very uproarious musical by William Finn, premiered 2005. And it is based, as the title suggests, around a spelling bee. Very funny, very heartwarming, really a charming show.
Now, I know last year you were able to have some people in person and then some people could watch, I think, virtually. Is that still going to be possible this time around?
I believe that will be the case this time, although we will be welcoming back a much larger audience than we did for Pippin. For Pippin, okay, we sat about 50 people in an 800-seat theater. We're hoping to get closer to 100, 150, perhaps more.
That's wonderful. So we'll keep you posted if you would like to see Gil's work in action. Okay, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you again to the Darien Library for hosting tonight's program. My friends, now might be a good time to go grab a box of Kleenex if you don't have one next to you, because Sunday in the Park with George, I believe, is one of the most moving and expressive musicals in the entire canon of Broadway. We'll talk about why that is and how Sondheim's score is so exquisitely crafted to elicit such a maximum emotional response from the audience, why it works so well. This is a question that I think we often ask ourselves when we listen to something that is especially poignant and moving. There are a number of things about this musical that work exceptionally well, and I would suggest to you that the first act is in many ways a sort of apotheosis of musical theater. It combines all of the elements that we love so well, and does so in a way that is both subtle and also incredibly obvious. So we'll address these points as we make our way through the program. We're here, of course, as Amanda suggested, celebrating the life of Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim died in late November this past year. He was 91 years old, and he was synonymous with Broadway in the second half of the 20th century. He composed musicals that are firmly ensconced at the top echelon of the Broadway canon, musicals that include, for example, not only Sunday in the Park with George, but Into the Woods, which we'll be discussing in February. Company before that, he was the lyricist for West Side Story, working with names like Arthur Lawrence, Leonard Bernstein, and of course, Jerome Robbins. He composed Assassins. He was a prolific composer who also wrote the lyrics to the vast majority of his musicals. In terms of collaboration, as I mentioned earlier, in West Side Story, he collaborated with some of the most celebrated names in the Broadway canon, but he also collaborated famously in the 1980s with James Lapine. And Lapine is a name that will come up several times tonight. He is credited not only as the book writer for Sunday in the Park with George, but also with being the guy who got Sondheim back into writing for the Broadway stage after Sondheim had basically declared after a critical flop in 1981, a show called Merrily We Roll Along, that he was done with the theater. It was James Lapine that brought him back, and posterity must be very grateful to James Lapine because by bringing him back, and specifically by introducing him to the story of George Seurat, the two of them were able to create one of the most memorable musicals that ever graced the stage. Now, other things about Sondheim that are worth pointing out before we dig into the score of George. Stephen Sondheim, a native New Yorker, grew up on the Upper West Side, grew up under, it must be said, rather tragic circumstances. His father left. His mother was visibly shaken by that event. She was a cantankerous and abusive towards him, prone to vituperative tirades. Not supposedly, Sondheim himself said it, so we have no reason to doubt it. She said, the greatest mistake I ever made in my life was birthing you. She said this to her son. We can imagine that this was a mentally ill woman, because only a mentally ill woman, we can imagine, would say such a vituperative, rancorous, and hurtful thing to a child. So Sondheim had, I think, what we could describe, and he has described himself as a rather unhappy and challenging childhood, despite coming from a wealthy family where he certainly was not subjected to any great privation, materially speaking, but certainly emotionally he was. The most important relationship early in Sondheim's life was the one he struck up with Oscar Hammerstein, who became something of a surrogate father. I mentioned that Sondheim's father had left and was not in the picture, so it was Oscar Hammerstein who was surrogate father in this case, and introduced him to the production crew of West Side Story when he was something like 25 years old in the mid-50s. And it was Sondheim who came over and took over the writing of the lyrics, which Bernstein was trying to shoulder. Bernstein was overworked. He was simultaneously writing the music for Candide at the time. And it was Sondheim who came in and began writing lyrics. At first, Bernstein was rather suspicious of this young upstart, this whippersnapper who was all of 25 years old. But by the time West Side Story premiered in the fall of 1957, Bernstein had developed a very healthy respect for the lyric writing capabilities of the young Stephen Sondheim. By the time we get to the 80s, Sondheim had become disenchanted with the theater. I mentioned earlier a critical flop, Merrily We Roll Along, although it is a brilliant score, has perhaps problems that merited some of the criticism leveled against the show. Sondheim himself was, as many composers have been throughout history, Mozart, famously, we talked in our previous lecture series about Mozart's reaction to what he described to be the fickle tastes of the imbeciles among the Viennese audience that attended performances of his works. Well, Sondheim was similarly disenchanted with the critics, and supposedly he forswore any future involvement with Broadway, I should say. It was James Lapine who convinced him to come back to the fold. And he said to him, I want you to come to Chicago with me. Sondheim says, Chicago? What's in Chicago? He says, we're going to go to the Institute of Art. Okay, what's at the Institute of Art? Well, they've got a painting there by George Seurat that was painted and completed in the 1880s. In other words, about 100 years prior to this fateful meeting. Come with me and see the painting. And so the two of them traveled to Chicago to go ahead and take a look at this remarkable painting. Here it is. Here is a Sunday afternoon on the island of Lagrange by George Seurat, painted in 1884. The musical, by the way, would premiere in 1984, so a nice round number for those of us keeping score. This is a remarkable painting for a number of reasons. Sondheim, like Lapine, was enchanted by it, and the tantalizing prospect of writing a musical around not this painting specifically, although the painting does factor prominently, but about the life of George Seurat, the overlooked, ostracized, and marginalized artist who created it, I think was a very attractive and compelling prospect to Stephen Sondheim and obviously to James Lapine. A couple of details about this painting before we get into the music. I mentioned a moment ago that George Seurat was overlooked and underappreciated in his own lifetime, and that is incontrovertibly true. Seurat was rejected by the artistic establishment of Paris, which had embraced the impressionistic style of painters like Monet, Renoir, and Degas, but had rejected the style of Seurat. Even though for some it may seem close to Impressionism, this is actually a quite novel style of painting. Seurat called it Chromoluminarism, and another name that would be attached to this style is Pointillism. Those two terms are intertwined. Pointillism that term is perhaps easier to unpackage than chromoluminarism. Pointillism has to do with the style of painting, the sort of short staccato dab-like brushstrokes that make up the colors on the canvas, the shapes ultimately on the canvas. Seurat was interested in optical illusions, and one of the great achievements in this pointillistic style, and specifically relating to chromoluminarism, is a really profound kind of optical illusion, which we'll talk about momentarily. Another interesting thing about Seurat is evidenced by the curious details that he includes in this painting, details that show him to be an astute observer and somebody who really picked up on minutiae. Let's consider what's going on here. First of all, what is the island of Lagrange? Well, this is an island famous for its beaches and park, where people would take ferries over. In the 19th century, you could see them in their Victorian garb, these characters over on the right, and they would sit in the shade and enjoy the fresh air that allowed them a kind of a respite from the rather fetid and dirty cities of the 19th century. The 19th century, of course, coincided with the age of industrial growth, the Industrial Revolution, and many of these cities really evince the qualities of the Dickensian hellscape that is described in books like Oliver Twist. In other words, they were sooty, they were grimy, they were dank. And for people who were often dressed, even in the summer, in full Victorian garb, heading off to the island and hanging out in the shade and looking at the water and breathing the fresh air was considered a mini vacation, an escape. You can see most of the characters here are in the shade. Certainly the characters in the foreground are, and even the ones who are often in the sun, many of them are holding parasols that cast shadows. One of the details that is not exactly obvious when we first glance, but becomes very curious when we recognize it, is the fact that this lady here, who is on the front in the foreground, on the right side of the painting, I should say, is holding a leash, and a monkey seems to be on that leash. A monkey on a leash? Who ever heard of such a thing? Was this guy Seurat lucid? Why on earth would there be a monkey on a leash? And what is chromoluminarism, the technique that was pioneered by George Seurat in the 1880s, that he bragged about to friends in the establishment who were not so interested in hearing about it? Well, chromoluminarism involves the juxtaposition of colors in very close proximity that provide convey to the eye a particular color which isn't actually present. An example of this would be the juxtaposition of the colors red and blue. If you put them very close together, little tiny dots of red and blue, they don't touch, they don't mix. And yet, because of their close proximity and because of this pointillistic technique that he had pioneered, what a viewer would observe from a distance is the color purple. Even though there is no purple, technically speaking, on the canvas, the eye would perceive the aggregate sum of red and blue, which is, of course, purple. So that's one of the things that if you were to put this under a microscope, you would notice. By the way, the canvas is enormous. It's still in the Art Institute of Chicago. It was acquired in the early 1920s, and it's something like 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, or 7 feet tall. So it's huge, massive canvas, and Seurat had worked on it for 2 years. And this painting became the inspiration for the musical. Sunday in the Park with George, the musical, did not do especially well at the Tony Awards. It won 2 Tonys in 1985. One of them was for set design. I always tell my students, don't put too much stock in these award ceremonies, because often the musicals that win the lion's share of awards are not the ones that are remembered by posterity as the great shows. That's true, for example, just to choose a show that I just mentioned, West Side Story, now a celebrated musical that's been adapted into not 1 but 2 cinematic films, did not win big in 1958. Most of the accolades that year went to The Music Man, which is a great show, and obviously it's topical now because Hugh Jackman is starring in the revival. But another example would be 1987 at the 1988 awards. Into the Woods, another Sondheim and Lapine collaboration, did not fare especially well. Most of the awards that year went to Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera, which there's nothing wrong with liking Phantom of the Opera. It's a great show in its own way, but a fundamentally different show than Into the Woods. All right. What else do we notice in this painting? We'll say a few more things and then we'll go on. First of all, the monkey. Seurat was observed at the Paris Zoo painting monkeys in a cage. People thought that this was bizarre. This was utterly inappropriate decorum for somebody who considered himself a serious artist. What would you be doing at a zoo painting monkeys? People were expected to paint canvases that involved inspiring landscapes, colors, light, shadows, lily pads, water, people, parents with their children, that sort of thing. Monkeys? Well, George Seurat painted monkeys, and so you can see there's one here in the painting Annaleigh. Most of the characters are in traditional Victorian garb, with the exception of this character in the foreground on the left. He's wearing a sleeveless shirt and a cap. This is the ferryman. He's the blue-collar guy who wakes up at the crack of dawn to begin ferrying the residents of Paris across the Seine and to the island of Lagrange. Other interesting details in this painting, we see the one character that seems to be looking straight at us is this little girl here. We'll talk about her later in the program. Finally, one last detail, which we'll have time to talk about, is this character over on the left, who seems to be holding, of all things, a fishing pole. Well, is this a reflection of something Seurat might have observed during his many trips to the island of Lagrange in the 1880s? No, women did not typically go fishing in the Seine River on the island of Lagrange. As I said before, it was a park and a refuge where people would go to walk around and take in fresh air. People did not, by and large, fish there, and certainly women did not. So what's going on with the woman with the pole? Well, you might think that this woman with the pole is trying to catch a fish, or we might rephrase that and say she's trying to hook a fish. Hook. Well, the island of Lagrange was a place known in the 1880s and during other periods for a thriving prostitution business, I guess you'd say. There were prostitutes who prowled the island of Lagrange. Men knew about this, and so it was a place where these sorts of assignations took place. And of course, Seurat is not going to depict this dalliance directly. So what he does instead, or these dalliances directly, what he does instead is he depicts a woman whose face is shadowed by a hat holding a fishing pole meant to represent a prostitute. Paris in the 1880s, a place with a skyline that was changing. There was a tower that was being built during this period. And what tower do you suppose that would have been? It coincided with a World's Fair. Of course, I'm talking about the Eiffel Tower. Now, some of the older residents of Paris lamented this ugly edifice that was going up in their beloved Paris. It's ruining the skyline, they said. I prefer to look at trees, they said. Instead, they got to look at metal, a metallic structure, building, and of course, would become one of the most iconic sites, not only in Paris, but in the entire world. There were people back then who objected to the building of this tower, and people, of course, who typically younger people, who looked upon it as a symbol of a new era. This clash is going to be captured in the musical as George talks to his mother, a minor character in the show, who is present typically on the island, where she is taken care of by her nurse, who always accompanies her. And she is actively opposed to any change. This is a very big deal. It may seem like a trivial detail, but I would suggest that at the core, the beating heart of Sunday in the Park with George is not just about art and an artist's relationship to the outside world, but it's how artists evolve. And therefore, it's a sort of microcosmic representation of how the world changes and how we have to change with it, whether we like it or not. There is no such thing as a permanent stasis. We can't freeze ourselves in carbonite as Han Solo was frozen at the end of episode 5 of Star Wars. We have to, as the song goes in Act 2 of Sunday in the Park with George, no matter what, we have to move on. All right, let's look at the score. One of the triumphs in the score is how Sondheim captures this sort of post-impressionistic soundscape that is associated with the 1880s and beyond. How he captures a sound aesthetic, which is not French exactly, but does evoke the, might say, the colorful harmony of French Impressionism. I'm not suggesting that this is an impressionistic score, but it has the echo of Impressionism. We can see that in this opening line here, as George is narrating. Imagine the curtain comes up, and there's George standing on a stage which is mostly blank. We can see that it is vaguely resembling the island of Lagrange, but in the beginning, it's just a white canvas, essentially, or the stage equivalent of a white canvas. And as George narrates, he says, "More boats." And here the set design really comes to life as boats spring up. More trees, and trees that the carpentry team in the theater will have developed spring up. Dot is with him. Dot is as important as any other character in the musical. I would suggest that this is a show that is very much about the relationship between George and Dot, and therefore it is a show that is very much about the relationship of the artist, George, a fictionalized version of George Seurat, but nonetheless a version of him, and therefore a paradigmatic representation of the artist, and Dot, his lover, his paramour, but not his wife. That's significant for reasons we'll discuss. We're going to listen to a performance here, the studio version, from just a few years ago, 2017, which was featuring two remarkable actors and singers. In the role of George, Jake Gyllenhaal, of all people, and in the role of Dot, Annaleigh Ashford. And it's particularly impressive that Jake Gyllenhaal, with his movie star good looks and his ability to earn tens of millions of dollars through movies, Jake Gyllenhaal devoted himself to inhabiting the role of George Seurat. And hats off to both him and to Annaleigh Ashford for brilliant performances. I had an opportunity to see this musical performed in this revival, and it was spellbinding. So we open up on the island of Lagrange. George and Dot are standing there in the morning. George is in the shade with his canvas out. He's painting, or it will look like an easel in most productions. Actually, he painted most of the painting in his studio, and that's how he was able to create that massive canvas that I mentioned. But in this version, he'll be working with something much smaller. Dot laments the fact that she's standing in the sun. "Why is it, George, that I'm melting here in my Victorian garb, long sleeves, my clavicle covered, a hat on in the summer, while you're over there painting in the shade?" But George doesn't respond. "George, hello, George. There is somebody in this dress," she says to him. These expressionistic, colorful bursts of sound articulate chords that come back throughout the musical. They're leitmotifs. They're fragments of music that represent painting, typically. Generally speaking, George talks about painting in the same way a musician might talk about composing. So there is a very obvious parallelism here between George and between Sondheim. Am I suggesting that the musical is autobiographical? To a degree, yes. This is a musical about an artist who is rejected by the establishment, much in the way that Sondheim felt rejected after 1981. This is a musical about the relationship between the artist and the outside world. Can an artist have normal relationships with people? For example, can they have normal relationships with the opposite sex? Can they have a stable marriage with children even? Can they have normal friendships? Can they have a normal social life where they fraternize and carouse the way, for example, somebody working in a bakery would? This is a question that the musical raises, and the answer is a sobering one. Let's listen to the opening number. We'll have just a few pauses as we analyze specific details in the score. Here is the opening number of Sunday in the Park with George. Now, do you see, even in this opening, these opening gestures, how when George says more boats, we get this musical flourish, and it represents the act of painting in a way. And so as you're sitting in the audience, you'll watch the boats come sideways onto the stage. When he says more trees, we get another one of these very colorful chords, these impressionistic sounding chords, and the trees rise up. And therefore, music is bound to the visual experience. In other words, from the very onset of Sunday in the Park with George, Sondheim charges head-on into the complex issue of how to represent the visual arts musically. He does so by creating this leitmotif, which represents the act itself of painting. We continue. As we make our way into the second system, and we're just seconds into this opening number, the music changes dramatically. We go from these impressionistic flourishes, which represent George's painting, to these dissonant clusters. They're not dissonant, they are dissonant. You have E sharp against F sharp. You know, it's not clear exactly what key we're in. It's tonally nebulous because we're being brought down to earth. We're back to reality. We're not in the impressionistic world or the pointillistic world of George's painting. We're now getting the perspective of Dot, who is sweating and uncomfortable as she models for George's painting. So the music changes to reflect that. Now notice here, she asks him, who was at the zoo, George? The monkeys and who? In other words, George Seurat had a reputation in Paris for being something on the order of a lunatic. Why else would any self-respecting artist spend his time at the zoo painting monkeys? So Dot asks him about this. Now she says, artists are bizarre. This is a bit of what we might describe as kind of a patter song. Many syllables and words spoken, or sung, I should say, without a breath. Dot will have her work cut out for her, rather the actress playing Dot will have her work cut out for her, especially at the end of the song where this stretch of patter song gets even longer. And you can see here that, you know, even if you don't read music, you'll notice there are a lot of inflections in the tones, meaning that typical for Sondheim, the music is chromatic and very, very complex. All right, now George is going to Sondheim gives us this very dense chord, a polychord that makes us feel like we're leaving some kind of dream sequence. Notice how seemingly callous George is. Not at me, don't look at me, look out at the water. Keep your wrist high, don't move this. George is the consummate artist. For him, he's interested in depicting his subject here, and he doesn't really care much for Dot's discomfort. And here, if you were watching the musical, what you would see on stage is the actress playing Dot leaves her dress at this point. And what I mean by that is she literally steps out of the dress and therefore steps out of the moment. In other words, she's no longer on the island of Lagrange. What she's going to sing in this next section, some of the most expressive music in the entire show, is sung not from her perspective as the lover of an eccentric artist on an island in a river, but rather as the lover of an eccentric artist who's meditating and reflecting on the nature of her relationship with him. Notice how the music changes when she begins to sing of how and why she is so attracted to George. The real-life George Seurat, by the way, was known for being quite tall and also for having a very recognizable beard. Now, that particular excerpt we just listened to from this opening number, that melody, that leitmotif will come back many times. Yum, bum, 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 bum. It outlines what we would call a minor ninth chord, in this case, B flat minor 9. Now, that might sound like gobbledygook, but because it comes back, it's worth pointing out because we want to be primed to recognize it when it does. Again, going back to the stage production and what this would look like if you were watching it, at this point, when Dot sings, I think I'm fainting, she goes back to her dress, steps back in, and we resume the action as she is back on the island of Lagrange, suffering not for her art, but for her lover's art, as George continues to paint her in full Victorian garb. We get a view, a window into the relationship between this eccentric artist and the woman that he loves. However, the question I posed earlier will come up over and over again. And that question is, can an artist have a quote unquote normal relationship with the outside world? Can they have stable, healthy relationships with, for example, lovers, with friends? Can they maintain active social lives? The answer for George is no, he can't. Why? Because his art has primacy in his life. It consumes him. It defines him. And therefore, everything else is ancillary in importance, secondary, back burner, if you will. And we, the audience, are presented with a microcosm of this existential conflict that George faces early on in the musical. You see, Dot puts up with George because she recognizes his genius. And she says that. I love you, George, she says in the first song. She says, I love your size, George. I love your beard, George. I love your eyes, George. But most, George, of all, I love your painting. I think I'm fainting. It's worthwhile to point out that she's not fainting because she's hot on the island. She's fainting because she is considering the scope and magnitude of what this man, through the power of his inviolate mind and the dexterity at his fingertips, is able to create. And so for Dot, her love for George is profound, and it's rooted in a deep admiration for who he is and what his talent allows him to do and what that represents. Unfortunately for George, he can't feel the same way about Dot because for him, his own painting has primacy, as we said. And therefore, there is a degree of, it's not narcissism exactly, but it resembles that. In other words, he believes that what he does is more important than anything else in the world. And therefore, everything else has to play second fiddle to it. And that includes Dot. And he half expects it, but he also knows that it is not a sustainable way to love somebody. He's going to sing a song about that later in Act 1. We'll listen to it. That song is called Finishing the Hat. It's a very well-known song. But first, we'll look at the fate of these two characters as it unfolds towards the middle of Act 1. Dot is getting ready for a big night, a big date. She's dolling herself up, getting gussied up. George is in the studio wearing his smock, covered in paint. And she says, George, should I wear this dress or that dress? And he says, oh, the red one, absent-mindedly, as if he's barely paying attention. And Dot says, oh, I'm so excited to go to the Follies tonight, George. And George, so lost in the reverie that takes place whenever he enters the realm of painting, which is often, dismisses it and says, oh, yes, indeed, yes, good. Dot goes back, she gets dolled up, she comes back to George at the end of the song Color and Light, and she says, George, are we going to be ready to go to the Follies? And George absent-mindedly asks, the Follies, what are you talking about? Not only has he forgotten about the date he promised her, he doesn't even remember that a half hour prior, he had acknowledged the date by telling her to choose the red dress. In other words, George is so much of what a later generation would call a space cadet that it has a decidedly salient, detrimental impact on his relationship with Dot, and Dot leaves him. She can't be with him because he can't give her what she needs. So she takes up with another man. And George, who spends many of his Sunday afternoons on the island of Lagrange painting, getting inspiration for what would become his magnum opus, spies Dot with her new lover, who will eventually become her husband. His name is Louie. And she sings a song called Everybody Loves Louie. Why does everybody love Louie? Well, she says, first of all, Louie's a baker. And that's great because a baker obviously creates something that's not abstract. Art is abstract. You can't eat a painting, but you can certainly eat baguettes and pastries. Not only that, the life of an artist is an erratic roller coaster, especially for someone like George Seurat, who, as we've said now, was rejected by his contemporaries in the Parisian establishment. So there is a symbolism, an allegorical meaning here when Dot takes up with Louie. Louie bakes bread. He literally puts bread on the table. George's life and his ability to provide is much more erratic, far less stable. So the life of the artist, again here, the musical is meant to capture the life of the artist, and George's life is not a stable one. So she takes up with Louie because he's good enough, as she basically describes it in this number. We're going to go to page 82 in the score. And look at Everybody Loves Louie. Here, once again, Dot is singing. The recording we're going to listen to is Annaleigh Ashford in that 2017 revival. Notice how it starts. She begins, "Hello, George. Where did you go, George? I know you're near, George. I caught your eyes, George." In other words, it's the same music that outlines that minor ninth chord that I described earlier when she says, "Your eyes, George. I love your eyes, George. I love your beard, George. I love your size, George. But most, George, of all, I love your painting." Here, it's the same music. And this is not the next song. This is, a good 25 minutes later in the musical. So when the leitmotif comes back, it's very striking. We haven't heard it in a while. So Dot is essentially gloating to George here. It's a rather petty move on Dot's part, but they have this relationship which is at times acrimonious. Let's listen to Everybody Loves Louie. Another striking chord, a polychord here. We've got F sharp major, but also what seems like a C major. So Louie bakes from the heart. What do we know about Louie? He's popular. Everybody loves him. Well, he's not the smartest, but he is an artist. So Dot, I think rather disingenuously here, compares Louie's art to what George does. Now she's going to come back to that leitmotif. Remember, when she sings, before it was in the opening number, she sang, "Your eyes, George. I love your eyes, George," which then became, "Hello, George. Where did you go, George?" Now she sings, "The bread, George. I mean the bread, George." Let's listen. It's interesting here. This is rather prurient language that Dot is using. She's alluding, of course, not alluding, she's directly referring to the sensual nature of her relationship with Louie. He needs her, so she likens herself to dough, which is being kneaded by a baker. And then, of course, when she finishes the thought, the music goes right back to the up-tempo, jazz-infused music, which represents Louie. And this music is rather simple comparatively. And there's that striking chord once again as we come to the most, I think, one of the most poignant moments in Act 1. Dot sings the following words: "We lose things, and then we choose things. And there are Louis and there are Georges." But she pauses. Notice the rest here. She doesn't finish doesn't hold the note through. She drops the octave almost and says, "Well, there are Louis and there is George." So first she says Louis and Georges, but there are Louis, but there's only one George. And when that moment happens, we get the music from her opening number when she sings those words that we talked about now a couple of times. "I love your painting. I think I'm fainting." In other words, at the moment where she says there's only one George, she sings the music which is associated with his painting. I love these words. We lose things and we choose things. She's lost George. She's chosen Louis. Those words are going to come back later in the musical. We'll take a peek at them at the very end of the program. Here's the end of the song. Louie's popular. Everybody loves Louie. Everybody gets along with him. Well, that's the trouble. Nothing's wrong with him. There's another line that's buried in there which is significant. Did you notice when she says, Louie sells what he makes, the implication being that George doesn't? Well, this was one of the things that saw George Seurat get ostracized from the Parisian establishment in the 1880s. He was very circumspect about parting with his works, putting them up in galleries and exhibits, and obviously selling them. For many in the artistic establishment, this was sort of a truculent attitude to take. What, do you think you're better than us? You won't sell your works, you won't part with your works, but we do it. Why won't you do it? So Louie is a simpler option. It's clear from the music where Dot's heart is. However, it's also clear that Dot has to make a choice. And this is significant. This is going to be very resonant when we get to Act 2. For Dot, the question of whether it's the right choice or the wrong choice is immaterial. She has to make a choice, and she makes that choice. And that's the important thing. This is going to have an eerie parallel in the world of art. Speaking of the world of art, we are going to hear from George for the first time tonight, and we look at one of the most celebrated songs in the musical. This is on page 96 in the score. Shortly after Everybody Loves Louie, George, who's just seen the love of his life traipsing around the island of Lagrange with a new lover, he is devastated emotionally, but he, like Dot, knows that he's made a decision that was the only decision he could make. And so in Finishing the Hat, by the way, also the name of a quasi-autobiography by Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim would later write a follow-up to it called Look, I Made a Hat, which is the last line in the song. Here's George, and he's alone. He's back in his studio, and he's talking to the characters in his painting. He's talking to his dog, and he is lamenting how things have unfolded. But this is a song that sits for the most part in the key of G-flat major. It's in a major key. In other words, it is not a tragic song of lamentation sung by somebody who is bemoaning the cruel fate that has befallen him. Instead, this is a song that conveys resignation. In other words, George understands that he's alone. He doesn't like being alone. He'd prefer not to be, but he understands that it's the only reality that can possibly be in store for him because of his identity as an artist, how he lives his life, and how everything for him that is not his art is of ancillary importance and must be relegated to the proverbial back burner, including Dot, even though she means everything to him. By the way, the name Dot here is chosen, I think, very deliberately. Dot refers to the style of painting that Seurat pioneered in the 1880s. Remember, we talked about pointillism, this style of short staccato stabbing motions with the brush that create little dots of contrasting colors, which when juxtaposed create that chromoluminaristic phenomenon. All right, this will be our second to last song in Act 1, and then we'll jump to Act 2. The program should conclude tonight around 8:15. Here is Finishing the Hat. Detrimentally impacted his ability to have relationships. You have to finish the hat, he says. What is he talking about? He's talking about the minutiae of finishing a hat in a painting. You can't go out to see the Follies, even though you've promised your lover a date. You have to finish the hat. And how you're always turning back too late. By the time you're done with the hat, it's too late. Sure, you finished the grass or the stick or the dog or whatever you're painting, but it's too late. The kind of woman who would sit there and wait for you all day is not the kind that you'd want to find waiting. You know, Sondheim gets a lot of credit as a composer. I don't think he gets enough credit as a lyricist. And we see his brilliance and lyricism on full display here in this segment. We continue. So what if you made a hat? But for George, he's created something out of nothing. And that perhaps is the most magnificent and enigmatic and breathtaking aspect of art in its various incarnations, creating something that never existed until the moment that the artist sat down to create it, even something as trivial as a hat in a painting. We could spend more time, my friends, putting the lyrics under the microscope, but I encourage you to read this libretto, listen to the score. Listening will do far more justice to this music than any words I could say to describe them. We come now to the end of Act One. George is resigned to his fate, to his solitude. But what about Dot? Well, she's gotten an unusual offer. There's a sort of obnoxious American couple that's visited Paris, and they've decided the only thing they like about Paris is the food, the pastries especially, the bread. So what do they want to take back to America with them? Let's get one of them bakers. In many productions, they're given Southern accents, I guess, so that we really understand that they're rubes. And they bring back a baker. Who's it going to be? It's Louie. Louie says to Dot, I've got an opportunity to come to America. Do you want to come with me and marry me? Yes, there's an extra wrinkle. Dot is pregnant in Act One by George. But George, rather callously, refuses to acknowledge the child as his own. As he says to Dot, Louie is the father. Louie will be a father in the way I never could be. And so Dot has the baby, and she, Louie, and the baby travel to America at the end of Act One, with George not even summoning up the fortitude to say goodbye. He turns away, and what do you think he does? He buries himself in his art. He has to finish the hat. Well, in this case, he has to finish the painting. I see in the Q&A, by the way, Ethan's asked that Dot's music is intimately connected to the music in finishing the hat. That's correct. That yada bam bada pi badi ba bada, that rhythm and that motif is present when Dot usually comes to a climactic moment, either in her opening number or in Everybody Loves Louie. What does it look like when we get to the end of Act One? Well, this is one of the most breathtaking things in the show. We're not going to have time to look at the entire number, but I will skip ahead and we'll look at a production. This is the original production from 1984, featuring Mandy Patinkin, there he is, in the role of George, and Bernadette Peters in the role of Dot. The chemistry between these two in the 80s in this particular show was celebrated stuff, the stuff of legend. Supposedly, when they were performing, even in dress rehearsals, some of their very expressive numbers, like We Do Not Belong Together, a song we didn't cover, Bernadette Peters had trouble maintaining her composure because of the emotional weight of conveying what those characters were burdened by. Let's listen to the end and watch how the scrim and the scenery and the carpentry and all of the visual elements come together. And there, of course, is the famous painting where we began our program tonight. You can see the lady with the parasol and the purple dress holding the leash with the monkey attached. Clearly, that was George's version of Dot, who was modeling for him in the very beginning of the show, the very first number. Remember, she says, George, there is someone in this dress. Well, this is quite a journey in Act One. What then happens in Act Two? Act Two begins with a reference to the fact that the real-life George Seurat died very young. He was in his early 30s. Doesn't spend much time reminiscing or reflecting or ruminating on his contributions to the art world. Instead, we, the audience, are teleported 100 years into the future, where there is another artist named George, and he happens to be the great-grandson of George Seurat from Act One. In the musical, he'll be played by the same actor who played George in the first act. We've been listening to the studio recording with Jake Gyllenhaal as George, but we just watched a clip from the original production with Mandy Patinkin as George. There have been some great Georges through the years, and Patinkin and Gyllenhaal, just two of them, two of the big ones. All right. What is it about this George that makes him different from his great-grandfather? And how do we know it's his great-grandfather anyway? Well, remember I said that Dot is pregnant and gives birth at the end of Act 1? And she and her husband, Louie, the baker, everyone loves Louie. They travel to America. And so Dot has this baby. She names the baby Marie. And Marie grows up in America. And Marie's grandson is George, the great-grandson of George Seurat. He's the artist. But he's not a painter. It's 1984. I mean, he's not painting the way his great-grandfather did, painting pointillistic canvases. Instead, he is a postmodern artist who specializes in light machines. So for Sondheim and for Lapine, for that matter, this must have been very topical, because in music in the 20th century, and especially in the second half of the 20th century, there was a question that was raised by many in academic circles and performance circles, which many of you are familiar with because you probably scratched your head and asked yourself this very question, and that is, are we supposed to enjoy postmodern art? Music, for example, by Karlheinz Stockhausen, where you have musicians playing tremolos and helicopters, or perhaps atonal works by Alban Berg and Arnold Schoenberg and Anton Webern. Are we supposed to enjoy this stuff? For an extreme example, we could look at John Cage, who famously, or perhaps infamously, wrote a piece where there are no notes at all. Music was changing dramatically in the 20th century. And I think what Lapine and Sondheim wanted to capture was how much the world of art had changed in 100 years. If you go back to the 1880s, we have Monet and Degas and Renoir, and we have composers like Debussy and Johannes Brahms and Gustav Mahler. And you fast forward not even 100 years, but 50 years, and music had changed so profoundly that, as Aaron Copland famously said, composers have chased audiences out of the concert halls. We've scared them away. So by making the great-grandson, the George of Act 2, a postmodernist who dabbles in light machines — by the way, he calls the light machines chromolums as an homage to his grandfather's pioneering technique of chromoluminarism. Remember, we talked about the technique of juxtaposing colors to create an optical illusion where the eye blends the aggregate total of those colors. So blue and red become purple. Well, what about this George? Whereas George from Act 1 is obsessed with painting, and it's his raison d'être, it is his reason for existence. It is bound up with the innermost core of his own identity. The George of Act 2 is a highly successful artist who is celebrated in exhibitions, and he's celebrated by the artistic community. And in many ways, his life parallels, in a sort of palindromatic fashion, his great-grandfather's. Whereas Act 1 George is passionate about his art, but is not commercially successful, the inverse is true in Act 2. What else can we say about him? Well, he's hit something of a creative block. The George of Act 2 doesn't know what to do, because these promo loom machines that he makes for his light show exhibits don't exactly tantalize him as an artist. And he feels, it's clear through the way he interacts with characters in the second act, that he's lacking somehow as an artist. Like, what he creates lacks integrity. And he doesn't know what to do next. He's become disillusioned and disenchanted. Now, most of the action in Act 2 culminates in a trip that the 1984 George takes to Paris for a show that will be celebrating his great-grandfather, and they've invited him to present his Chromolume number 7 at the show. He takes with him his 97-year-old grandmother, Marie, who, if you remember, was the illegitimate daughter in Act 1 of the original George and Dot. By the way, the actress who plays Dot is going to make an appearance in Act 2 as well, in a song we're going to look at and put under the microscope in just a moment. What then is the role of the artist in contemporary society in 1984? If artists are no longer painting people and rivers and sunlight and grass and these inspiring things that the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists embraced. What is the objective of an artist, whether it's a painter or any other kind of artist? You could ask the same thing about a musician who is writing postmodern atonal music that alienates the audience, as Copland said. What then is the role of the artist in society? George asks himself this question. George struggles with many things in Act Two, art first and foremost, but also his own identity. He's always kind of questioned whether he is in fact the great-grandson of the great George Seurat. He doesn't disbelieve his grandmother, but he reconciles himself to the fact that his grandmother has never met her supposed father. It could have just been a story that Dot told Marie, practically 100 years ago or 90 years ago when she was growing up. But then he, as you might predict, the character Marie dies. She's very advanced in age. And George is going through some of her effects, and he finds an old a grammar book that was his great-grandmother's. It was Dot's. Dot in Act One is not literate, and so she teaches herself to read. And there are notes in the back that make it clear to young George that George Seurat was indeed his great-grandfather. And this just compounds the crisis that he's experiencing as an artist. The burden of creating art, knowing that his great-grandfather was this profound creator, this innovative man who developed techniques which are studied and imitated, it taunts him in a way. So what does he do? Well, he sings a duet. It becomes a duet. And he sings a duet with whom, you might ask? With Dot. Some of you are saying, wait a second, with his great-grandmother, who's deceased at this point? One of the most brilliant things about the way that this song ends, or really the way the show ends, the way this song ends the show, is that it presents us with two realities that work somehow, even though they are completely contrasting. Let me explain. George is singing to the spirit of his great-grandmother, to a vision of his great-grandmother. It's the Dot that he never knew, but that represents the muse that inspired his great-grandfather. That's significant. Remember, because we said that young George, it lacks motivation. He's lost his impetus to create art. Dot is singing to George, her great-grandson, but the words she sings can just as easily be understood as addressing the George she knew in the 19th century. My friends, we come now to the end of the musical. Here on page 221 in the score is Move On. And here, crystallized, distilled, and coalesced in a nutshell is, I think, Stephen Sondheim's attitude and his, you might say, his Weltanschauung, the way he perceived the world as an artist and what he thinks the role of the artist is in society. We listen to Move On, and then we'll have some time for questions. You can't help but be deeply stirred by Dot's words here. Again, she could be plausibly addressing George, somehow transcending space and time, or she could be addressing the George that she knew in the 19th century. I chose, and my world was shaken. In other words, I chose to leave you. I chose Louie. So what? The choice may have been mistaken. Maybe, she says, I should have stayed with you, speaking to the George of the 19th century. That choice might have been wrong, but making the choice was not, because the fate, the destiny of any artist is to evolve, to move on. You can't meditate and spend all your time worrying about what if. You have to make a decision, and the making of the decision itself is de facto the correct move to make. We continue. Anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. You can see clearly how Sondheim would have been very drawn to this story. It would have been a way for him, as it turned out it was, to make an emphatic statement about the artist's role in society. Yes, there may be scathing critical reviews. There may be apathetic, indifferent, nonchalant contemporaries and colleagues who simply don't understand or don't care. But the fate of the artist, the dedicated artist, whether it's George in Act 1 or George in Act 2 or Stephen Sondheim himself, is to create something. Because that, de facto, is what defines the artist. It's what George refers to at the very end of the iconic song Finishing the Hat. What does he say when the song ends? Quizzical lyrics, right? He says, finishing the hat. Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And I think for Sondheim, those words reflected his own stance with respect to composition and to working on Broadway. Unfortunately for us, he did come back to Broadway by writing this musical, and he didn't throw in the towel and go off to write film scores or video game scores or whatever he was contemplating in the early 80s. He was contemplating both of those things, by the way. I hope, my friends, that you've enjoyed this foray into the score of Stephen Sondheim's Sunday in the Park with George. It's worth mentioning, by the way, as a postlude, that when Sondheim passed away in late November, some of you will recall that Broadway stars came together under the baton of Lin-Manuel Miranda. And what did they sing on the streets of Manhattan to honor this great titan of the stage? It was Sunday. It was the ending of both Act 1 and Act 2, both end with Sunday, which is the simplest, most understated, and one of the most elegant things that Sondheim wrote. Harmonically, very straightforward, and yet one of the most emotionally powerful things he ever wrote. To strike that balance, I might suggest right now, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and it is one of the many feathers in the cap of Stephen Sondheim. We'll be revisiting Sondheim in February, by the way, when we look at Into the Woods. I see we have a couple of questions in chat. Ethan asks, pursuant to the earlier question about sharp keys and flat keys, I think there is. If you look at Dot's music when she sings in the opening, it's in B flat minor. And what we get here at the end of the show is B major. There's any number of ways to interpret it. We could say it's just happenstance, it doesn't mean anything at all. But what I hear there is how the music is modulated up a half step. So it's in a major key. Now there's a happy ending. You notice what Dot sings at the end. We always belonged together. That's in direct contrast to the Act 1 number, which we skipped, which is we do not belong together. And in that number, we have this, or I should say, if we contrast the opening with the ending, we have this sense of moving on. Literally, we've moved on from B flat minor. We're now in B major. So a happy ending that literally has moved on by going up a half step. So that's a little bit inside, but good question. Andrew Garfield could play an amazing George. Well, I think what Sasha's referring to there is Andrew Garfield's performance as Jonathan Larson in Tick, Tick, Boom. And for those who have seen Tick, Tick, Boom on Netflix, I do not get paid by Netflix to plug anything on their platform, but Tick, Tick, Boom showcases not only obviously the career of Jonathan Larson, but it tells the story, and that story intersects often with Stephen Sondheim and specifically with Sunday in the Park with George. And one of my favorite moments is when Andrew Garfield's character, Jonathan Larson, is watching on PBS Sunday in the Park with George, and he kind of shakes his fist at the screen and says, "Gosh darn it, George, why can't you just tell her to stay? Just tell her you love her." And when a musical can make you feel that way, where you want to shake your fist at the characters and say, please just do this, that, or the other thing, we know we're invested. And in many ways, that represents the apogee of the audience experience. Let's end by saying that, for Jonathan Larson and for many others, Stephen Sondheim was one of the primary inspirational forces in their lives. And in the movie Tick, Tick, Boom on Netflix, that's very, very evident, and especially in that diner scene where they sing a version of Sunday. So any other questions? I see the Q&A. I think we've answered everything. Well, my friends, it's been a pleasure to be with you. I want to once again thank the Darien Library for hosting tonight's program. I will see everybody in about a month when we reconvene for Into the Woods, and we will be talking about Sondheim's unadulterated, unfiltered, undiluted, authentic stage version, not the Disney version that got so many things wrong in 2014. So if you know Into the Woods through Disney and that film, you'll want to attend this so we can give
We're
you
going to go into a different woods.
give you a sense of what the canonical version should be like, a different woods, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Gil. This was wonderful, and I loved your closing remarks. That was just a great way to wrap it up. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Everyone, I hope you have a great night. I know it's supposed to snow tonight, so be careful in the morning with your travels.
Absolutely. Until next time, my friends.
Bye.